love is one of those social practices that, if it works the way I think it does, opens practical possibilities historically in ways that didn't exist earlier, by bringing into being new social realities.
Welcome everybody to the first episode of the philosophy podcast Common Thoughts, run by the research group for classical German philosophy at the Faculty of Ljubljana. You can find us on our official website under the name Speculative Thought. We are currently working on a project entitled The Common Between Substance and Subject, a Hegelian proposal for a new social ontology. So my name is Bojana, and I'm delighted to have with me today philosopher Paul Kottman from the New School for Social Research. Professor Kottman has published widely and across the divisions that structure the discipline. In classical German philosophy, in aesthetics, and the philosophy of arts, in social and political philosophy. He is the author, most recently, of Shakespeare, Hegel, and Modern Ethical Life, delivered at Fudan University, Shanghai, and published in Chinese in 2022. Love is Human Freedom in 2018, and editor of The Art of Hegel's Aesthetics in 2019. He is also the editor of the book series Square One, First Order Questions in the Humanities for Stanford University Press. His book, Love is Human Freedom, has recently been translated into Italian, L'amore come libertà umana, and it resonates with our own efforts of how to think of the common in the project, as will become clear later. So, good afternoon, Professor
Good afternoon. It's great to be here.
Great to have you here.
Thank you for having me.
Professor Kottman, according to you, love is neither a natural appetite like hunger or thirst, nor a specific mental state we stumble upon, nor procreative activity, but, as you put it, historical transforming practice of a special kind. Namely, it articulates not only our entanglement with each other, our concrete, messy ways of being with each other over time, to use your beautiful formulation, but how we make sense of other things. So my first question would then be, what other things does love help us explain? What can we hope to learn through love? Or another way to put this would be to ask, what is the object of self-discovery in those practical instances in which love does become known? And maybe a sub-question, and what do such cases promise to disclose about our freedom?
Mm-hmm. Well, thanks again for having me, Bojana, and for the great set of questions. I'm not sure I can do your questions justice in the short time we have, since in some ways that's really the task of the book, to exfoliate those questions. But maybe I could begin by saying what I really wanted not to do in this book. I really didn't want to answer the question of what is love. Mm-hmm. Because I don't think it corresponds to a what is kind of question, the way that we can ask what's a glass of water or what's a coronavirus, questions that can be taken up according to their nature. And so I thought, well, it might be better to proceed by seeing if love is something like philosophy or religion or art, in the way that Hegel talks about those three things as practices through which we make sense of whatever we think we can make sense of. And so beginning that way, I began to think that there are a number of just puzzles that certainly I have, but I think they're widely shared. For example, we're living through what seems to be one of the most immense transformations in human history, the division, or the dissolution, rather, of a gender-based division of labor. Mm-hmm. And the formation of new kinds of kinship, starting with sort of bourgeois family and nuclear life in the last couple of centuries, and lots of internal upheavals and transformations in the last 30 or 40 years that on the scale of human history look like really radical transformations in our self-understanding. The advent of the legalization of abortion and birth control. And then behind all of that, I was wondering, well, given the manifest equal intelligence of women over the centuries, why has there been so much patriarchy and sexual domination? These are not only my questions, I think these are widely shared questions in the human sciences, but I was dissatisfied with the answers to those questions that circulate, and thought that if I looked at love as a internally transforming practice over time, I might come up with some new answers to those questions. And so that was one ambition.
Okay, thank you. And how would you say love as a form of self-understanding reflects upon our freedom? How would you describe the intimate link between love and freedom?
Yeah. Well, I have a very peculiar understanding of freedom. So I don't mean, for example, a voluntarist conception of the sort you find in, say, Augustine, notions of free will, and I don't mean so-called negative freedoms from tyranny or from want or from hunger. And something closer to what you find in classical German philosophy, in figures like Hegel, where freedom would be a certain kind of social relation where the demands of reciprocity and mutuality are not exactly met. I don't think they can be met once and for all, but articulated and worked out dynamically in ways that look less and less coercive, as it were, less and less organized by facts of nature or facts of culture, somehow internally transforming. So that's kind of a mouthful, but free in that complicated sense. And maybe the way that you could say this simply would be to say that love is one of those social practices that, if it works the way I think it does, opens practical possibilities historically in ways that didn't exist earlier, by bringing into being new social realities. So through the ways that we treat each other and touch each other over time, transformations in those ways, new social realities and commitments and values and beliefs get organized, on the basis of which we can do different and new things. And so freedom in that possibility generating sense is what I was interested in.
Okay, great. So freedom in the sense of actuality producing, as I've...
Yeah, exactly. Actuality, potentiality producing.
Opening up of new possibilities.
Yep.
Thank you. Okay, so to move forward with the questions, in your book you suggest, somewhat provocatively, and I find the thesis very interesting, that oppressive or coercive sexual practices are not manifestation of the effects of, say, restrictive social norms like sexual domination. If we take an example, that in some other times, say non-capitalist times, non-patriarchy-oriented times, might be different. So, but what you say is that it seems to me that you claim that social norms and power relations are not explanations for how we brutally can treat each other at times, but that such brutality can only be explained by sexual domination itself, once it is seen as merely a necessary stage in the accomplishment of love as human freedom. So I found this thesis very interesting and thought-provoking.
It's a terrifying thought, it seems to me. I even though it's my thought in the book, I'm still, as it were, terrified by it. The thought that that sexual domination, institutions of sexual domination, patriarchy being, let's say, the name for the most diffuse form of sexual domination, that these are moments in the story of human freedom that I'm trying to tell, I find to be a disturbing thought. I mean, it becomes slightly less disturbing and more familiar if we consider that so much of modern social thought, since Rousseau really, attempts to explicate forms of non-natural inequality, let's call it, forms of institutional domination, and where they come from, why they get the grip they do, men is everywhere, men is born free, but everywhere in chains, Rousseau's remark. So there's always this question of how and why do these institutions emerge? And to take up your question, what I really wanted to insist on was the specificity of sexual domination. And the idea that the right, let's say, to dominate another sexually, in my view, doesn't simply descend from some other right or norm in the culture, for example, economic or military or political, from some other prerogative, but is its own internally worked out prerogative, responding to something in sexual practices. So the way I try to explain it, as you know, since I know you've read the book, but for those who haven't, I try to suggest that that sexual practices transform internally on the basis of the way in which they respond to what I call threats to sense. The threats to the sense we can make of anything. And one of the earliest, in my view, threats to sense that sexual practices respond to is the demand to make sense of propagation and reproduction. And that once that idea gets worked out, the idea that human beings are sexually reproducing creatures and certain gender roles can be assigned on that basis, it can start to look as though sexual practices are unfree, simply moments of biological necessity. And it's to respond to that secondary threat to sense that I think institutions of sexual domination begin to emerge as a way to explain how one can be agential, acting sexually. So it's a terrifying thought, the idea that sexual agency and sexual domination intertwine institutionally. But I believe that's the case historically, and I try to demonstrate that.
Okay, I see. So just to reiterate, sexual domination is not a specific type of domination among other dominations, but it's correlated to the elements of sexual activity as such, these two.
Yeah, it's an essential part of the history of human sexual practices.
Okay. Okay, so maybe to continue the...
Of course, I mean this institutional domination is what I have in mind. The idea of right over another's body.
Of course.
Not play.
Yes.
That's a different moment.
Okay, maybe to continue the provocation. So sexual domination, however wrong, is then not contingent, happens in some place, some time, particular historical time, but acts as a kind of necessary condition to achieve love and freedom. So you even speak of a transcendental foundation of sexual domination. So I was wondering how and why, or if let me ask you this differently. What do we lose or fail to explain when we insist on trying to frame sexual domination and all other, say, social, gender-based hierarchies as simply bad norms or contingent norms? So what do we lose if we reduce the idea of sexual domination to this?
One of the things I think we lose, to start at the end of your question, work backwards, is a sense of how it is that we have formed and hold our own commitments, if they are, as it were, not to perpetuating sexual domination, as I hope they're not. And if you stop to think about it and you say, well, gosh, how is it that at a certain point in human history, in only a few parts of the world and very provisionally, I don't want to make this sound more prevalent than it is, but arguably, in some parts of the world over the past few centuries, a way of life has emerged whereby institutional authority accrues to sexual relationships that are understood explicitly, publicly, to be non-coercive and non-dominating. Call it love-based relationships or loved-based marriages and commitments. And if you want to tell a story that explains how that came to be, that's different from the one I give, I believe you're stuck with, for instance, the alternative of saying, well, at a certain point in the 18th century, wealthy landed gentlemen in Northern Europe just woke up and got nice and decided, well, we should share our prerogatives and property with the women in our lives. I just think that's a completely implausible story. So one of the things that's lost is explanatory force.
Yes.
But more deeply than the explanatory force, let's say, a sense that what we're standing behind in our own values and commitments is something more than just local custom or the way we do things around here. And it's part of the broader project of this book to try to suggest that love is human freedom in the way I discuss it is not just a local practice or particular set of cultural commitments and beliefs, but a fundamental way in which we educate ourselves as to who we are as human beings, transculturally. And so I think we would lose that as well.
Okay. So love is neither a local practice nor a reaction to current, let's say, prevalent social norms in a specific society.
Yeah, I mean, it's always also that, but it's not primarily that.
Okay. Yeah.
So of course it's also that, in the sense that certain kinds of courtship rituals and formulas and poetic expressions and so forth are going to be, to some extent, locally determined. I don't mean to deny that. But what's at stake, let's say, in the dialectic that I try to unfold, starting with sexual reproduction, working its way through sexual domination and into what I try to describe as the historical achievement of lovemaking, to use a sort of quaint word in English. That I think that that's actually something that's not simply a local or even Western construct, but that goes to the core of what it is to be a human being.
Yeah, and this leads us perfectly to another question. You seem to trace down the emergence of historical transformations of love, and to connect this with our failure to make sense of ourselves, of our own shared self-understanding. So, for example, and these are the examples you explain in details in the book, you mention how our ancestors gave up the idea that reproduction was a natural process, giving rise to a new shared practical form of self-understanding, namely that human life is sexually reproductive, and then how lovemaking was a response to our inability to live out the social authority of sexual domination and sexual reproduction. So it seems there are other examples as well, but it seems that we have a series of failed shared self-conceptions and then love practices that emerge as a response to them. So my question would be, in what makes this sense-making to fail? I mean, when does a set of reasons acquires normatively transformative potential as articulated in love?
I think sense-making fails all the time.
Okay.
So there's a quick answer to that one, but it's a very rich question that you pose, Bojana. Maybe one way to begin to answer would be to say that I tried to begin the core section on sexual love by reminding myself and the reader that human beings, so far as we can tell, are the only species, certainly the only species of mammal, that understands how it reproduces sexually. Which is remarkable when you think about it, because it means that there's something, as it were, beyond the sheer biology of it, something in our self-conception that intervenes in our reproduction. And so I want to begin with that thought, to say that that there must be sensuous experiences, things felt, undergone, suffered, that can't be explained according to a reigning self-conception. So once we understand ourselves as reproducing sexually, there might be aspects of our sexual life that are not reducible to reproduction, that then call for explanation. For instance, the pleasure, the pain, the disappointment, the heartbreak, the list can be quite long. And all of those things operate as what I tried to call threats to sense. So let's say sensuous experiences that then call for some further attempt at sense-making, by which I don't mean simply making intelligible. That is just a part of it and is very fragile and can fail easily. But I just mean a new self-conception, in light of which we then act and treat each other differently. So, for instance, if there's halfway through the story I tell roughly, in the case of Othello and Desdemona, if Othello can't live with himself, in my reading, thinking that Desdemona is simply obedient to him, can't bear that thought. He wants her to be acting, as it were, on her own. Right? It belongs to his self-conception as a lover, different from his self-conception as a general in the army, that Desdemona not obey him. And yet she's constantly declaring her obedience at every turn in the play, saying, I swear I'm obedient and faithful. And so there's something in his lived experience with Desdemona that he can't account for.
I understand, yeah.
And I'm interested in those moments, and vice versa from Desdemona's point of view. You know, it's as if she understands herself to be, on her own account, freely taking Othello as her husband. She declares this at the beginning of the play publicly. And yet, how can she actually demonstrate that to him, such that he'll believe her? And I think insofar as at that moment in history, and Shakespeare, I think, is very perceptively aware of this, that can only be done sexually, from Desdemona's point of view. We get the terrible end of the play that we get. But so I'm interested in those moments of how felt apprehension of what is nevertheless an operative self-conception don't fit.
Okay.
I call those to be threats to sense or crises
so
in
it's
sense.
at the level of feeling and sensuous experiences that this ruptures, breaks into accustomed form of self-conception and self-understanding arise out of which they arise. Okay.
And in the case of love, in the case of family and sexual love, the two forms of love I treat in the book, it's specifically around the question of touch and treatment, which are typically, as it were, senses that particularly philosophical theories of the senses devalue in favor of seeing and hearing. Arguably the most theoretical senses according to most philosophers. And so as a kind of corollary to what you just rightly said about sensuous experience, I was particularly interested in how the way that people touch each other and treat each other might actually be a kind of response to crises in sense-making in ways that I think have been underappreciated philosophically.
And one that is conceptually operative.
Yeah, exactly.
And not...
Exactly.
Okay, yeah. Degraded.
Bound up with our self-conception.
Yes, of course, degraded to kind of lower knowledge.
Right.
Yeah. Okay. So maybe to move on to Hegel a little bit.
Okay.
You've already mentioned him. So one of the thoughts, Hegel's thoughts, you seem to sympathize in the book is that Hegel's conception of love as mutual recognition, of being with oneself with the other. So, as Hegel puts it, and one such element to meet this demand or fulfill this demand is also, contrary to intuitively as it may sound, upbringing of a child or family love, let's put it rather in these terms. So there is another line of reasoning on love in Hegel, namely that love is a contradiction that reason cannot resolve, as he says, and it demands opposition of one individual towards another individual. So it does not tackle the unifying bond resulting in a happy family life, but rather a conflictual state between individuals who are not willing to get together and engage into any kind of unifying activity. So I was just wondering, do these two conceptions go together, or are they relatable? How do you understand this?
Yes. I mean, I'm going to answer this as it were using Hegel, but not in order to better understand Hegel. So I'm just kind of helping myself to some things from Hegel in the book. But maybe I can divide my answer to your question in two parts. On the one hand, in Hegel, as you rightly point out, there's this sense that love names something that on the face of it looks like a logical contradiction, but is actually the resolution of opposition. Okay. And this is actually something that you see from the very earliest writings of Hegel and the early writings on love and so forth, right through the logic. There's passages in the center of the logic where he says this, all the way down to the later texts in the philosophy of right and the lectures and so forth. So I think, in a sense, all of that can be grasped somewhat, let's say, helpfully for my purposes, by just remembering what Jean-Paul Sartre says about love in Being and Nothingness, where he says, "You are my freedom." And the idea is just that unless the other person is acting freely, well, then I'm not free either in a love relationship or a friendship. Hegel's other examples. So far, so good. But the other piece that's of use to me is a kind of historical diagnosis Hegel makes, and this gets at what you said about children. So Hegel was very perceptive in the philosophy of right in seeing that one of the most important social historical transformations he was living through was the transition from what you might call pre-modern marriage to modern marriage. So from the idea that marriage is primarily organized around economic demands and property relations, to this sense of two people committing in a love-based I do sort of relationship that would have its own normative authority. And Hegel thought, well, one of the things this does is it completely transforms relations to children, because to the extent to which the child results not just from property demands, economic necessity, or biology doing its thing, and instead the child can start to seem like, as it were, the result of a love affair, then it comes to be possible to see the child as evidence, if you like, of objective evidence of love in the world. And I think that's very perceptive on Hegel's part, and I wanted to, as it were, draw on that perceptivity. But I think there's also a huge shortcoming in Hegel's account, and it has to do with the account of women in that story, and the way in which Hegel didn't anticipate, as I think he should have done, already available in the novels that he disparages in the philosophy of right, the worry that once love-based relationships start to have that normative authority, that binding women to maternity, biological maternity, produces an untenable contradiction that becomes the core of, picked up, let's say, in the discourse in literature in ways that Hegel's philosophy misses. And so, as you know from the book I wrote, I tried to devote a significant amount of attention to seeing what novels tell us that Hegel doesn't about that.
That was an interesting point you raised, namely conceiving of a child as a product of love affair and not in terms of any kind of procreative purposes. So I was wondering if I find this conception astonishing. So and your book clearly delves into in a very nice manner dwells into this topic. So I was wondering, do you have any answer? Maybe why is it so that this topic or this has not been researched so far?
I wish
yes.
I knew. I have no idea.
Okay.
So on that question, I don't know, to be honest with you. It seems to me that I obviously I wrote the book, so I'm the last person to tell you why others haven't written it. But I wanted to pick up on your interest in this question of parenthood, let's say,
yes.
and the question of maternity. So part of what I'm interested in is how the more that sexual reproduction ceases to be an operative self-conception in relations to children, which is strange when you think about it, right? The more the question of parenthood can finally be posed as a properly human question, rather than an economic concern or a matter of social duty or raising future role bearers in a social world. And so therefore, by the same token, the more the question of, well, what is a child can be raised. Yeah. And so, here there has been other work done on this, but you could argue that, the childhood is itself a 19th century invention. And that the question of what it is to relate to beings that are genuinely free from the get-go, not the result of biological necessity merely, is a kind of cultural question we're just now getting ourselves into positions to ask.
Yeah,
and I think that reproductive technologies and new forms of kinship over the last 30 or 40 years are finally, as it were, at the end of the story I try to tell, putting us in a position where we can begin to ask these questions more seriously.
Okay.
And live them more seriously.
Of course.
At the end of the day, a matter of lived practice. So see how it works out.
Okay. Lived practice, we've just started to re-question right now.
Yeah, exactly.
Exactly.
I think one of the reasons, just to kind of to spontaneously say something that I didn't say in the book, but it's interesting to look at how much cultural anxiety exists around childhood and parenting. And we tend to attribute this, I think, popularly to Freud or early 20th century foregroundings of relations between parent and children. But I think that actually Freud himself is a symptom of what I'm describing. That something deeply transformative over the course of the modern period I describe in the book in sexual love totally transformed our understanding of what it is to have children or to be children. And this has made for obviously tremendous anxiety around upbringing, education, parenting, social commitments, how much social authority to give to families and with respect to the state or with respect to schools and so forth, or the medical industry. But all of those questions, I think, are tied to this radically transformative self-conception of ourselves as free lovers.
Okay, thank you. Maybe a more general question for the end. So, how do you think love as a historical transforming practice may or can help us in our endeavors to anticipate new forms of the common and in actualization of our freedom? So this would be.
I mean, here I have I've been thinking about how to bring in the common for this podcast or this videocast. I hope it might be useful to say that one of the problems we have in the human sciences right now is how we might talk of issues of common, general, universal interest rather than of local interest merely. And this is a problem for history, this is a problem for anthropology, it's a problem for politics, it's a problem for philosophy. And one of the things that I think my book wants to show is that love is a social practice, if I'm right about it, that is not merely a local custom, that it's genuinely a human practice that operates transculturally. And so while particular elements of the story I tell will be based on the knowledge I have of the culture in which I operate, I believe that the story I'm telling in the chapters, as it were, as they unfold, that these are not of mere local interest, but of genuine transcultural interest. And it would be a good question to ask all of us, really, if the book I've written is useful as an example. What other kinds of social practices might be treated in similar ways? I can think of a few examples. For example, schools, education as a social practice, and also some inverse examples. Slavery, for instance, where the practice transcends cultures and times and places, and therefore offers a clue to what might be not merely locally normative in what human beings do with each other, but really a form of self-education all the way down.
Okay. So, so it's love is first and foremost human product, and it reminded me just of what Hegel says, late Hegel, in Encyclopedia, when he tries to depict forms of, let's say, common in some sense, where he says that love is the only way we relate to each other as individuals and not as mere anthropomorphic, confessional or animals. So this is the way he depicts it, also as a human product and something that makes our individuality and constitutes our freedom.
I wanted to make sure I said in the book that I certainly have no interest in drawing a line between the human and the non-human, or the human and the pre-human. I think this is an open question. And if it could be shown that animals educate themselves to be lovers in the way that I describe in the book, well, then I can only welcome that and admit that that's true. So I have no interest in suggesting that I have a difference between the animal and the human and the plant in mind as determinant for the discourse that I'm offering.
Okay, so
we teach ourselves to be human.
Okay, so maybe if you have any concluding thoughts, the time is now.
I see. Well, I've got lots, but I was glad to respond to your prompts and really appreciated the questioning. So thank you.
Yeah, and thank you for being here with me.
Okay.
Okay.